Okay, thank y'all so much for joining us for Clear Up the Chaos. I can't believe we are halfway through the year. I have Mitch and Emily from Ironwood joining us, and this has been pre-recorded due to some summer vacation obligations that had already been made. So I appreciate Mitch and Emily hopping on, and hopefully this will just give our viewers the time to view at their own convenience as well. But here we are, like I said, in June, and lots has taken place regulatory. And so I'm going to kind of hand things off to Mitch to review what has transpired and where organizations should be, things that they should be looking at as we approach third and fourth quarter. So Mitch, I'm going to hand things off to you. And again, thank you all so much for taking time out of your schedules.
You too. Thanks, Elizabeth. So like she mentioned, with June being the midpoint of the year, we wanted to take some time to reiterate on some of the big changes that have happened earlier this year. I know we've covered a couple of these updates previously, but for those of you that haven't been tuning in monthly, we wanted to cover some of the bigger changes just as a reminder, as well as to make sure that information's out there for people that may not have caught those videos. But one of the big ones was back in January, the FTC proposed a new rule that would effectively ban employers from implementing non-compete agreements. The intent behind that was they wanted to free up employees to be able to move and grow within their career. So while the final determination hasn't been implemented yet, it's worth still taking a look at because it would essentially nullify any pre-existing non-compete agreements, as well as overly restrictive non-disclosure and non-solicitation agreements. So while it hasn't been formally enacted, there has been growing support for the regulation. While I was preparing for this, I was actually able to come across a memo from the NLRB General Counsel within the last couple of days where their position is that most non-competes are a violation of an employee's Section 7 rights, based on the chilling effect that they can have on the employee's ability to threaten to leave work or go work for a competitor as a means for them to secure improved working conditions. Or if it's a situation where they are transitioning to another company as a part of a other protected activity. So for example, if a subcontractor were to switch, or a client were to switch to a different subcontractor that's union, those union employees could potentially switch contractors, and their stance is that non-compete could potentially interfere with that process. So while it's not necessarily in place yet, and neither of those rulings are formal law at the moment, it is still worth taking a look at any sort of current restrictive covenants you have in place. So things like your non-competes, your non-disclosures, and your non-solicitation agreements, to really ensure that they're as tailored as possible in terms of duration, geography, and scope, so that you can really hone in and make sure that you're focused on those business needs as opposed to just handing them out to everybody with a very blanketed approach so that everybody's getting caught up in it. That's going to increase the likelihood that your non-competes would be invalidated. Whereas if you have them tailored towards your higher level, harder to replace employees, you'll see a lot more of a positive result from it. Tying in with that, there were also limitations on severance agreements that were in process. So non-supervisory employees, so your generic workers, your laborers, things like that, they were found that they wanted to, or that a lot of severance agreements tended to be overly broad in terms of confidentiality restrictions, non-disclosures, and non-disparagement clauses and waivers. So while Amanda did an amazing job covering that back in March, a lot more in depth, the gist of it was that instead of taking the position where employers are allowed to be more permissive of general waivers that use blanket terms that effectively silence employees if they accepted a severance agreement, employers do now need to take a lot more care and consideration into making sure that those clauses are more narrowly focused and well-defined. So for example, instead of just saying you can't say anything about your previous employer, you tend to have to say things like you can't make anything that would be defamatory or otherwise illegal from that standpoint or untrue. So basically, you'll want to take a look at both your non-competes and your severance agreements and just make sure that when you're using those, it's because you need to, as opposed to just handing them out in a blanket approach. Another one that hasn't necessarily hit Texas, but it has been becoming more popular, and I'm kind of anticipating that it's going to continue to grow, are pay transparency laws. So we're at about 10 states so far that have passed it, as well as a handful of cities passing different variations of pay transparency, which basically it's there to try and provide clarity to what the salary ranges are for a given posting, whether that's internal or external, so that there's an even playing field. They're trying to move away from those situations where everybody's applying for jobs, nobody knows what the salary range is. So certain groups or classes were being negatively impacted by that, where they may not have had the negotiating power to try and balance that out. And then they come in and suddenly it's, oh, well, because I'm Caucasian, I'm making more than this person. They want to try and address that issue there. So with a big component of a lot of these laws has been the inclusion of salary ranges and job postings, like I mentioned. And while I mentioned that it hasn't necessarily hit Texas yet, there are some states, so Colorado and California were two big ones, where if there's a job that can be done remotely from that state and you're willing to hire somebody from those states, you do need to include that job or the salary range in that job posting. So that's just something to be mindful of if you are open to expanding into those states. Just making sure that you're complying with those other state laws, because they are affecting potentially remote workers as well. That said, while it is a big shift, there's still research ongoing. It's still fairly new in the research process, but they have shown that there have been some impacts of it. For example, the shift to transparency tends to show that your employees are paid fairly and they're rewarded in a fair manner for their efforts. So rate increases are tied to their productivity. There tends to be an improvement in employee morale and productivity because they see that their efforts will matter. Conversely, if your pay programs aren't fair, and then the transparency comes in, you'll start to see that drop in morale and drop in productivity, because people look at it and go, okay, well, it doesn't matter if I work harder when it's who you know. So if you are looking at shifting to more of a transparent pay process, it's worth taking a look at your current pay structure and trying to implement those checks and measures to make sure that your pay processes are equitable. Kind of shifting gears a little bit. So the Pump Act was another big one that came up. So the Pump Act was there to address the employee's rights to take reasonable break time for a mother, specifically for pumping breast milk. There were recent changes this year that expanded the protections to exempt employees. But as part of that act, it does require that employers provide a private space for pumping free from view and intrusion, and it can't be a restroom. So you need to find a secure space that's comfortable, has a comfy chair. There need to be outlets for the pump machine, things like that. The other big piece of it is that employees need to be able to take a break to pump as needed. So you can't just mandate, okay, your break's at 10, this is your time for pumping. If the employee feels the need to go pump, they need to be free to go do so. That space needs to be available for them. And they need to have those areas available for up to 1 year following the birth of the child. So it's just something to keep in mind if you do have and expect an employee. Just start kind of coming up with a game plan. Maybe you need to figure out a space or a way that you can secure an area so that they can have those facilities when needed. Another big one that happened recently was the health emergency for COVID ended back in May. So with that health emergency ending, one of the biggest changes was insurance providers are no longer required to waive costs or provide free health tests, free COVID tests. While some providers may still offer free or discounted testing, it's ultimately up to that provider to determine that. As far as vaccines, they're typically going to still be free in network, but they took out that aspect where you can go to any place with any insurance and get it covered. So you may potentially be charged if you're trying to get your vaccines, your boosters, and you're going out of network. Tying in with that, the vaccine requirements for international travel were lifted. So if you're a business that has the international component, it's just something to keep in mind. While a lot of the employment impact is more focused on the benefits side, there are still some HR considerations if you do opt to continue COVID testing your employees, such as who would be liable for the costs associated. Another big change that happened was they went through and updated the summary of your rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. The changes weren't substantial. It was mostly just updating contact information and stuff like that. But while that was rolled out in April, if you're a company that conducts background checks on your employees, it's worth taking a look and making sure that you're giving out the newest summary of rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. The reason being is by March 24th, 2024, you do have to be using that new form. So whether you're running them internal or you're using a third-party background check service, it's worth taking a look, making sure it's updated. If you're using a third party, reaching out to them to make sure that they're using the correct one, just to make sure that you have everything in place. More recently, there were actually a couple of updates to the federal posters. There's also going to be one upcoming here soon as well, but we wanted to cover the first two for this part. So the FLSA minimum wage poster was updated to include exempt workers under the Pump Act. And then the FMLA poster was updated to clarify that while it is typically unpaid, employees can use their paid leave concurrently with FMLA. So with that in mind, since you're going to be updating those posters anyway, now's always a good time to go through and just double check. You can scan the QR codes on a lot of them to make sure you have the most current version of the form. If you're not sure what posters you need, if you go to the Department of Labor's website, they have a law poster or an e-law poster advisor. It's an amazing resource for determining which posters you need. You basically answer questions, and then once you get done, it'll spit out all the DOL posters you'll need. And then it also has links to other agency posters, so things like EEOC required postings and stuff like that. So while that covers the federal side, it's also a good idea to take a look at your state specific stuff. So if you Google, for example, Texas workplace posters, it'll take you to the Texas Workforce Commission or whichever states you operate in. It'll take you to their Department of Labor page. All of these websites should have links for you to download those posters. You can also go out and find a third-party poster service that will send those out to you. But if you're in a pinch and you need to update quickly, just pop it onto the DOL website or your state DOL website to get those posters is an easy path. Just to reiterate the posting requirements, you do have to have them posted in a visible place. So a lot of the time you'll see them on bulletin boards and break rooms or entryways, things like that. Where it can get a little bit tricky is with remote workers. But one of the simplest approaches would be to design an accessible portal. If you have a company intranet or an employee portal that you use, things like SharePoint, put all your required postings in there. Make sure you have the instructions on how to access those in the handbook or your handbook acknowledgement. And then it might even be worth including those into your applicant portal so that they can be viewed by new employees. Another big one that got a lot of attention, but really wasn't as substantial as it initially seemed was Helix versus Hewitt. And I did a deep dive on that one, but the gist of it was there was a day rate employee whose daily rate was high enough that it met the minimum requirements for the weekly salary basis test. However, the Supreme Court ended up ruling on the side of the employee instead of the employer because of a simple mistake that the employer made. In their case, they didn't have the weekly guarantee as required under the salary basis test. So in doing that, because they didn't meet that standard of having that weekly guarantee, they ended up paying out millions of dollars to this employee. So if you do have day rate employees, it's worth taking a look at your pay structure and making sure that even if they're meeting the minimum requirements, making sure that in their offer letter, you still have that weekly guarantee in their pay to make sure that it meets that minimum requirement under the salary test. Switching over to FMLA, at the end of May, the Wage and Hour Division actually published an opinion letter clarifying that if a holiday occurs during an employee's normal work week, and the employee works part of the week, so say the employee comes in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday's a holiday, and then they took Thursday and Friday under FMLA, you cannot deduct that holiday from the employee's leave entitlement, unless that employee was scheduled to work on that Wednesday, in which case they actually took a day off. So then it would count towards their FMLA accrual. Keep in mind that that's only for partial work week situations. So if the employee's taking the whole week off, you can still count that towards a full week of their FMLA leave entitlement. But even if they work, say, Friday, holiday was on Monday, since they worked that one day, you can't count that Monday holiday towards their FMLA usage unless they were scheduled to work that Monday and took it off. So with that, I'm going to shift gears a little bit before we start diving into some of the upcoming changes, and let Emily dive into some potential fines from the DOL as far as unpaid PPE dressing time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mitch. That was great information, and I appreciate you starting us off. If you've listened to me before, hi again. If this is your first time listening, I work for Ironwood, obviously. My name's Emily, and I kind of do random things for Ironwood, but mainly focused on like HR, brand development, recruiting, that kind of thing. But today I am switching gears a bit to present you a case that sheds light on the importance of fair labor practices and the consequences of noncompliance. So recently, the federal court jury required East Penn Manufacturing Company to pay a substantial amount of $22.25 million for wage and hour violations. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, this verdict is the largest recorded jury verdict under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Today, I'll discuss the details of the case, the allegations against East Penn Manufacturing, the implications of the verdict, and to close it out with some practical tips for employers to ensure FLSA compliance. So before really diving in on the case, I wanted to take the time to remind everyone or educate those that may not know certain terminology that is used within the case. For context, this case revolves around employees being unpaid for proper dressing time where personal protective equipment or PPE is concerned. And I want to note that East Penn Manufacturing is dealing with lead acid batteries. So think automotive batteries versus like AAA batteries, motive like forklift battery or battery for like a semi truck, batteries to power your boat. So heavy duty. And these batteries are listed as a Class 8 corrosive hazardous material. So some required PPE may be rubber gloves, overalls, aprons, eyeglasses, face shields, and maybe even a requirement of showering after the shift. And that's just to name a few. There are safety precautions East Penn Manufacturing employees must follow to avoid lead poisoning and other harmful fumes. So keeping all that in mind, here are some terms that you will hear a lot, one being FLSA. You may already know this one, but in case you don't, it stands for Fair Labor Standards Act, which establishes minimum wage, overtime pay, record keeping, and youth employment standards affecting employees in the private sector, federal, state, and local governments. You'll also hear the Portal to Portal Act, which requires that employees compensate workers for some activities that occur during the workday. These could be like coffee breaks, rest periods of 20 minutes or less. It could potentially be like a fire drill, maybe some short meal times, things workers do throughout their shift that does not require them like relief from all of their duties, so they're not clocking out. Another term you'll hear is doning, which means putting on gear or equipment like prior to the shift. And you'll also hear doffing, which means taking off gear or equipment at the end of the shift. This equipment or gear can be as simple as safety glasses or earplugs, or as complex as special gloves or protective clothing. Doning, again, doning is putting on, can take 30 seconds or as long as 30 minutes. It's fair to consider that there may be a wait for gear to be distributed, or maybe the locker room location may increase travel time to the work site and back at the end of the shift. And lastly, I want to mention the term de minimis, which means too trivial or minor to merit consideration, especially in law. So keeping all of this prior information in mind, here are some details of the case. The U.S. Department of Labor filed a lawsuit against East Penn Manufacturing Company, a private, non-unionized, family-owned lead acid battery manufacturing company, which is the world's largest single site. The lawsuit alleged that the company failed to pay approximately 11,400 employees. who worked at its battery plants in Lyon Station, Pennsylvania between November of 2014 and September of 2021 for the time they spent putting on protective clothing at the beginning of their shift and undressing and showering at the end of their shifts. The Department of Labor claimed that East Penn Manufacturing did not pay employees based on their actual clock in and clock out times, but adjusted times to pay employees only for their scheduled shifts. So some implications of the verdict. The federal court jury's verdict carries significant implications for both East Penn Manufacturing and employers in general. So the Department of Labor will request an equal amount in liquidated damages for the affected workers and an order requiring future FLSA compliance by the manufacturer. U.S. Solicitor of Labor named Seema Nanda emphasized that employers must pay employees for all hours worked, including time spent changing into and out of uniforms and showering if such activities are necessary and indispensable for their work, meaning unavoidable. This verdict serves as a stark reminder for employees to reconsider policies that attempt to skirt the law. So you may be wondering why or what East Penn's manufacturing response was to these allegations. So Donna Schneider, the vice president of marketing and advertising for East Penn, stated that the company had made every effort to comply with the law as it understood them. The company believes it provided proper compensation for the time spent by employees donning and doffing uniforms and showering. East Penn Manufacturing Company stands behind the compensation it provided and maintains that it was fair in determining the reasonable time required for the activities. So when you get into the jury's decision in the defense claim, the jury rejected claims related to employees who did not wear uniforms, a significant portion of the government's wage claim. Michael Mueller, an attorney with Hunton Andrews Kurt in Washington, D.C., who led the defense for East Penn, expressed satisfaction with the jury's verdict, stating that it rejected 90% of the government's wage claim. The jury agreed that East Penn did not willfully violate the FSLA and disagreed with the government unsupported high time estimates. The defense team maintained the jury's findings align with their position entirely. So now you may be wondering, how did East Penn manage to mispay 11,400 employees for donning and doffing? So East Penn Manufacturing, they had two timekeeping systems. One of them recorded when employees swiped in and out for their shifts, while the human machine interface or HMI system registered when employees started work on the production line. So the employees get their schedule of 8 to 5, show up on time, takes the time putting on their PPE, and then clock in and actually start work on the line. So that could put them at 8:15, 8:20, just depending on how long it takes to put on the proper equipment for the shift. So East Penn used HMI data to calculate hourly pay, overtime, and bonuses. Again, that system only tracking when the employees started and ended work on the production line, and did not factor in the potential 3 minutes, 30 seconds, 30 minutes of donning and doffing. The FLSA mandates that activities before or after the workday that are an integral and indispensable part of a principal activity, so something the employee must do for the job or their safety of the job, must be compensable. East Penn acknowledged that the time spent donning safety gear, shedding gear, and showering is compensable under the FSLA, but East Penn disputed the legal requirement to compensate for the actual time spent on those tasks. So now you may be wondering, how can your company avoid a lawsuit of paying $22.25 million or less or more? So here are some practical tips for employees, because obviously if East Penn had their employees actually clock in right when they got there versus once they started on the production line, all of this could have been avoided. So much to Mitch's argument of just that one company not selecting that box, it could have been avoided of $22.25 million. So to ensure FLSA compliance, employers should keep accurate time records and pay employees for their actual work hours rather than scheduled shift. Meaningful time spent on activities such as donning and doffing safety gear should be compensated, but minor tasks may be considered de minimis and not compensable. Employers should communicate clearly with employees regarding work hours, expectations of accurate time recording, and the importance of not working off the clock. It is crucial to establish effective channels for reporting concerns related to compensation. So what is compensable, what isn't, and where do you start? So in answering these questions, consider the following. The principal job activity. So under the FLSA, as amended by the Portal to Portal Act, employers generally need not compensate employees for preliminary and post-preliminary activities unless the activities are integral and indispensable, meaning they are done for the benefit of the employer and they are necessary to the principal activities performed. So principal activities are any work of consequence performed for an employer. Time spent on principal activities is compensable, even if activities are performed outside regular scheduled employment hours. So again, if your scheduled time is 8 to 5, you clock out off the production line at 5 o'clock, but you still spend 15, 20 minutes either taking off your personal protective equipment or showering, such as East Penn employees are required to do based off of the hazardous material they're dealing with, that should be paid for. So another question to consider is if donning and doffing function complex or is it minimal? Time spent donning and doffing gear is considered de minimis if the time spent is minimal or inconsequential. Courts have taken into consideration the administrative burden to monitor and record, the total amount of time involved, and the regularity of the activity. While there is no bright line test, generally a few minutes has been noted as being a negligible or small amount of time to be non-compensable. So again, if it's like, seconds versus minutes that add up, you'll want to make sure that your policies follow. Another thing that you could ask is worksite donning, doffing required, or is it employee choice? Courts have held that donning and doffing may be an integral and indispensable part of the principal job activities and compensable if and when the gear is unique to and required by the job, the employer's rule, and or by statute or ordinance. If employees elect to don and doff at home, the activity is considered preparatory and or concluded to the job. Therefore, that time spent is not considered time worked unless payment is required under union contract, custom, or practice. Also, if clothing change is more for comfort or convenience, then is also seen as non-compensable. So in general, changing clothes, including uniform, pants, shirts, and non-exceptional safety gear is considered ordinary. Therefore, time spent putting them on and taking them off is usually not compensable. Similarly, washing hands after the shift is also typically considered ordinary and an employee's choice, and therefore not compensable. The donning and doffing of unique protective gear, however, may be. If it is found to be compensable, then walking to the workstation afterward and vice versa would also be compensable. You could also consider asking what is established history or collective bargaining agreement. A factor in deciding compensability of donning and doffing if the employer's established custom or practice. It is not the number of years the custom existed, but rather proof of long-standing or acceptance by employees and or their union to have discussed the accepted practice. So in a union environment, the collective bargaining agreement is key as far as what is being bargained to be compensable. But again, keep in mind, East Penn was also non-union. Lastly, you could also focus on just like applicable laws, regulations, and court cases. There are a lot of court cases out there that serve as a learning experience or for reference if you are worried about, wages and violations. And because the time spent putting on uniforms or protective gear is specific to an employer and a matter of fact of circumstance, many employers will implement the following activities to facilitate good faith for compliance. So you could train frontline managers and staff about activities that are compensable and considered hours worked under the FLSA and Portal to Portal Act. Employers should also verify that their training includes examples of all preparatory activities considered to be on the clock and preliminary to the principal activities of a given job. You could also review and update timekeeping processes and policies to eliminate further confusion. And you could also provide staff with examples of the organization's unique and protective gear standards in accordance with its industry or government safety regulations. So essentially during your next best practices annual audit, identifying preparatory and concluding employer mandated activities that are integral and indispensable to preliminary work, and determine if the time spent is compensable. You can evaluate locker room location in relation to time clocks or production areas, reassess your contracts, the culture, and pay practices to confirm your employees are accurately paid for compensable time. So, in conclusion, I threw a lot at you, but the recent federal court jury verdict against East Penn Manufacturing highlights the significance of adhering to fair labor practice under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Employers must pay employees for all hours worked, including activities integral to their job. This case serves as a reminder for employees to ensure compliance with FLSA regulations and avoid policies that may infringe upon workers' rights. By maintaining accurate time records, compensating employees for actual worked hours, and promoting transparent communication, employers can mitigate the risk of wage and hour violations and contribute to a fair and just work environment. There is considerable litigation on this topic, and each situation is based on its unique circumstances. But as more professions need complex required equipment and gear, compensating for doning and doffing will continue to be investigated. And again, I know I threw a lot at you, but if anyone has any questions regarding doning and doffing, FLSA regulations, or concerns of wage and hour violations, Ironwood is always happy to assist in these needs. And I just really appreciate your attention. I'm going to pass it back to Mitch, but thank you so much.
Thanks. So at the beginning of this video, we covered kind of some of the past changes that have happened over the year. Now we're going to pivot a little bit to some upcoming things. There's one that I think we've been tracking on since, I want to say October or September, the potential overtime ruling. Still no updates on when or if there will be an update, but I'm sure that something's going to happen sometime in the year. We'll get more clarification on it. But I do know that when it happens, we'll be on future calls covering it more in depth. We just don't know exactly what that's going to look like, whether that's just an increase in the salary minimum or if that's going to be changes to the eligibility rules and to the duties test, things like that. Another big one that we've been seeing a lot of are more and more states passing the Crown Act. So I think we're up to 20 states, including Texas and Michigan in the last couple of days. But the Crown Act stands for Create a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. Essentially what it's there to do is prohibit dress codes that target protective hairstyles, so things like braids, dreadlocks, or twists that have historical ties to specific races. In Texas, that'll be taking effect on September 1st, 2023. But now's a great time to take a look through your dress code policies and make sure that you're compliant. And if not, take a look at how you might be able to adjust that to get compliant. Another big one that's going to be taking effect here at the end of the month is the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. So that takes effect on June 27th, 2023. While this overlaps in some ways with ADA, Title VII, the Pump Act, and FMLA, this act is strictly focused on accommodations. So it's going to affect companies with 15 or more employees. It also has a new poster that is already out. So while you're taking a look at your DOL posters, go ahead and download this one and get it on display. But as far as things that employers can't do, you can't require an employee to accept an accommodation without a discussion about the accommodation between the worker and the employer. You can't deny a job or other employment opportunities to a qualified employee or applicant based on the person's need for an accommodation. You can't require the employee to take leave if another accommodation can be provided that would let the employee keep working. You can't retaliate against an individual for reporting or opposing unlawful discrimination under the PWFA or participating in a PWFA proceeding, such as an investigation. And you can't interfere with an employee's rights under the PWFA. So if that sounds familiar, it's because it's very similar to the ADA and other religious accommodations and regulations that are already in place. So if an employee does come forward, whether they're requesting an ADA accommodation, religious accommodation, or now a PWFA accommodation, have that conversation with them. Figure out what their needs are. So it'd fall under PWFA if it's related to their pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical condition. So from there, once they've come forward and said, hey, I might need an accommodation, or hey, can we look at adjusting this? Have that conversation with them. Try to find something that's going to be reasonable. A couple of the examples that the EOC provided were things like providing uniforms or PPE that's appropriately sized, providing additional break time or rest time, even something as simple as drinking water, all the way on up to excusing them from more strenuous activities or exposure to chemicals that could impact the pregnancy. So that's where having that discussion is, so that you can work with that employee to find what's going to work for them. If it's something where they may need to be able to sit part of their shift, that's fairly easy to accommodate depending on the position. So you'll want to go through, have that conversation, document what the accommodations are. It's my monthly plug for documentation, but you'll want to include in that documentation what was proposed, what was accepted, what'll be done, and make sure that you have signatures from both the employee and whoever's signing off on the employer's side. And that way, if you ever need to defend it, everything's solid and in play. But probably the biggest one that's coming up, this is going to hit July 31st. Once it takes effect, you'll have 30 days. So by August 30th, you need to be completely in compliance. But July 31st, the remote verification of I-9s will be ending. So any I-9s that were done remotely dating back to March 20th of 2020, so the last 2 years, if it was reviewed remotely, you're going to need to go through and do an in-person physical verification of their I-9 documents. Which, depending on how many employees you've hired, that could be a lot. I mean, if you're dealing with hundreds or sometimes thousands of remotely completed I-9s, you're going to want to get an action plan in play. So a couple things to keep in mind. You're going to want to notify the employees, give them a heads up on it, let them know what's going on and the reason for it. Like we covered when we did change management, stuff like that. Good communication is key to mitigating issues and helping make sure that things run smoothly. How you actually go about it's going to be a little bit different. I mean, if your company does paper copies versus electronic, there's going to be intricacies in that you'll need to address. Ideally, your company's been tracking which ones were done remotely and which ones weren't ahead of time. But if you weren't, you may have to do some more work on the back end to identify the employees you'll need to bring into compliance. From there, you'll need to decide whether or not you want to perform those physical inspections on site, or if you're dealing with a lot of remote employees, you may need to find an authorized third-party representative that can go in and do those inspections on the company's behalf. So as far as kind of third-party inspections, there's no firm, hey, these people are approved for it. A lot of the times you'll see notaries and stuff like that. Outside of a handful of states like California, they do have to be, I believe it's a licensed immigration counsel. But generally speaking, any notary can do it. Basically, I'll look at the documents, verify that everything's acceptable, and then they'll sign off on the I-9 on the employer's behalf. If it's done virtually, you'll want to take a look at how your electronic I-9 vendor is going to have it. They should have a workflow to update those. But it might be worth reaching out now so that once, you can get a jump start on it, but you don't want to be getting to August 30th and realizing, hey, I still have hundreds of these employees left to do. So as far as kind of the physical inspection piece, when you're updating that I-9, if it's the same person who signed off on it initially, they should be able to just indicate the date that they physically examined the documents and then include their initials in the additional information field. If it's somebody else who's reviewing it, so for example, let's say Emily ran the I-9 initially that was done remotely, and then they brought me in to do the physical inspection. I would be the one signing for it. And then I'd put my full name and title along with the date that it was done in the additional information field. So you'll just want to make sure that you have that addressed fully as opposed to just initialing it. So with that in mind, and I know that's going to be potentially a lot of work depending on how much hiring you've been doing over the last 2 years or 3 years. Time flies and you're having fun. But tying in with that, there is still a proposed rule in play. Is published in August 2022. They haven't really finalized anything. I think that's part of why the I-9 form hasn't been updated yet. That's potentially coming as well. But they are looking at trying to find alternatives to the in-person inspection, particularly with the growth of remote work and stuff like that. So as more information comes out, we'll be covering that more in depth as well. But I mean, with it being the mid-year point, I know I've covered a lot of different topics. Emily covered a great one. But now's a good time to really take a step back. You know, you made it through tax season. Perfect time to start going through your processes and policies to make sure you're compliant with those state and federal regulations that we've covered. Some local municipalities have also been passing different ordinances. So it's worth taking a look, you know, just periodically making sure you're in compliance. You know, make sure you're scored away on things like FMLA, ADA. Companies tend to grow. So you may have bumped up over that 15 employee threshold for the ADA or now the PWFA. You may have bumped up over that 50 employee mark for FMLA. So start working on getting those processes in place. If you do have any questions on anything, or maybe just want some additional information, you can go ahead and reach out to Elizabeth. She can get you our contact information, square the paperwork away, and then we can run it from there. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Elizabeth so we can wrap up. Thank you again.
Thank you all so much. I know we have been getting questions in regards to the I-9, you know, changing that's taking place. So I'll be sure to forward any of those questions over to y'all, and don't hesitate to send those questions either to myself or directly to Ironwood, and they'd be happy to assist. But lots of valuable information and lots of things to take into account as we go halfway through the year. Can't believe it. Time flies. But I hope each of you are having a blessed and safe summer, and I will see y'all back here in July. Thanks, guys.